I'm not a chief. But I do like him. I like him. Cause I like,
We suck right now.
but they got McCaffrey back, so that helps
Yeah.
a little.
A little, yeah.
I picked up their kicker in my fantasy league and he missed like 6 field goals the other week.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, come on, man. I had -3 points from him.
Oh, we don't have good.
Not anymore. What? This technology is ready for break or something. I don't know what's happening. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Okay. Let's just start with a nice light topic. How is it? All right, I didn't even touch it. What's happening? What? It's like in its own world today. I don't understand. Okay, there we go. Okay. So a couple of things. So in my class before this, my daughter is in like the health center at her school. And so I told them to give her some Advil and send her back to class. But if they call me again, I might have to go get her. She's so dramatic. I feel bad saying that. I love her to death, obviously. She's my kid. But like the second anything hurts, it's like, I'm done. Like, she'll literally be like, I'm done. I told her she should go into acting. But so we'll see. I've been watching my phone for that, so forgive me. But she had a headache this morning and apparently it got worse. I don't know. Oh, it got worse because she's at school, was my thought. But a couple of things beside that. What we'll do today is we'll wrap up this chapter, chapter 16, just have a couple of slides left. And then we'll get into chapter 17. Not the easiest of topics between this and then we get into power and sexual coercion, but they are important topics related to sexuality. So we'll talk about those a little bit today. Obviously, I won't see you next week. I wrote that up there. I've been writing that up there in case just for some reason you didn't remember or you don't know. But I leave tomorrow morning. I'm very excited. So we will be gone next week. There will be a homework assignment on Monday. So on Monday, make sure that you watch for that announcement. It'll go out Sunday night. And it's a brief homework assignment related to chapter 14. So just make sure you do see that and turn that in. There won't be anything on Wednesday, but on Monday, I will be giving you like a little alternate assignment, which is also on the syllabus, if you forget, but there will be an announcement that goes out. And then when we come back after next week, when we come back, we have one chapter left, which will be chapter 18 on selling sex. And then we have our final and little closing assignment, and then we're done. We're really close to the end of the semester, which I think is sad, right? I get sad. I'm a sentimental person. I get sad at the end a little bit. As happy as I am for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the holidays, I'm still sad that we're almost done. So that's kind of our plan from here. I did grade all of your homework assignments that you submitted. So all of those grades should be visible to you. If you didn't turn your homework assignment in, you can still do so at any time for late credit, which is better than no credit. So if you didn't do it, feel free to email it to me at any point. And forgive me next week, if you email me anytime between like Friday to next Friday, so in that span, if you don't hear back from me right away, it's just because I really don't have internet. Okay, so if you need something, feel free to email me, or if you're confused about the assignment or whatever, just if I don't get back to you right away. I try to be really good about that, but I won't have internet, so forgive me in advance. But I will eat a croissant for each one of you. I'm thoughtful like that, right? And my class before, so I have a lot of croissants to eat, but I can do it. So, are there any questions about next week or anything related to that? Anything at all before we jump back in? Yeah. No, so all next week, right? We don't have class. So the campus has class, but we won't. I know, it's a week from Thursday, and it used to be that we got the whole week off. And then it used to be that we got Wednesday off. Now it's only Thursday and Friday. So a lot of people cancel that day because the attendance is through the floor. But we won't. have class that because I will be in Jamaica on that day. Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, so last time we were talking about paraphilias, right? And we talked about, if I go back just for a minute here, because it feels like a while ago. So the non-coercive paraphilias, remember, those are things that are consenting, often private acts. They're legal, right? They're things that are between two consenting adults. And the coercive ones are ones that are often illegal. People can't give consent or they're unwilling. And then we are talking about a bunch of examples of those. And we left off here. So one of the coercive paraphilias that's obviously illegal, in this case, because the person can't give consent because of their age. So one of the ones here, pedophilia or pedophilic disorder, is when people have intense arousal or desire related to children, right? So people who are typically under the age of 18. We sometimes call this individual a sex offender, a pedophile, right? A child molester. The technical disorder name is pedophilic disorder. And the tricky thing about this is it's defined differently from state to state. Every state has different legislation around the age for how we would define this. It's really pretty crystal clear when one person is an adult and the other person's under 18. So if somebody who's like in their 20s or 30s or 40s and a teenager or a child, it's really clear. Where it gets messy is when you have two people who are in their teenage years. Right? So if you have someone who's 18 and someone who's 13, technically that would fall under this category. Or two people who are 17 and 16, very rarely prosecuted when like two people of a similar age engage in sexuality together. But when there's a huge gap in age, like an adult and a child, they can't give their consent, right? They might not be aware enough, right? They're not able to consent to any kind of activity. And this became something that was like a law back in the 90s, right? So there was something created called Megan's Law, which was a federal law that mandated that every person who is a convicted sex offender or convicted pedophile be like posted on a site where people can have access to it. And I don't know if any of you have ever looked at this. It's a really interesting and kind of frightening thing to do. But if you click on the image here, I have it linked to the Megan's Law website. And you can go on there and put in your address, and everyone who lives around you who's a convicted sex offender is registered on it. Right. So the second that you are convicted of pedophilia or any kind of sex offense, right, you are actually listed on this site for life. It's a really controversial thing because it includes all sorts of things like urinating in public or indecent exposure, like anything related to like any kind of sex crime, you would be listed on this website forever. Right. So if you're interested, you are welcome to check that out. It will show you everyone around you. But this is something that became law back in the 90s. As a way to protect yourself and know who is around you for people who've been convicted of a sex crime. So pedophilia, obviously illegal because we're looking at someone who can't give consent due to their age. A couple of other examples: frauderistic disorder, zoophilia, and necrophilia. These are some other types of coercive paraphilias that are illegal. Right. And so frauderistic disorder is rubbing up against people in a crowded place. This is really common in like subways, crowded, like public transportation. And it's almost exclusively done by men. Men who will like rub up against you, sometimes pull their penis out and rub that up against you on a train or on a crowded like public transportation. And they often, again, get aroused by your disgusted reaction. That's something that's kind of consistent that we see. It's that disgusted, appalled reaction that tends to get a response. Contact with animals. Obviously, animals cannot give their consent. That's zoophilia. Contact with people who are no longer alive would be necrophilia. So again, the coercive paraphilias are things that are illegal because people can't give their consent, or it's against your willingness to have it happen too. Lots of examples, but these are some of the ones that the book covers. Yeah.
If they get turned on by like the disgusting reaction.
Yeah.
Like I know in the moment it's hard, like what would be the appropriate reaction to the, I guess, like the situation and not make it like
Not make it
better for
worse?
them, I guess, or yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, as hard as it would be to do in a moment where somebody did something like that, something as simple as like, oh, excuse me, or like just, ignoring it to the best of your ability. And obviously that's not always easy to do. Like if you're standing next to someone and they've pulled out like, their anatomy and they're rubbing it against you, it'd be really hard not to react,
Yeah.
right? Like I don't know how you wouldn't, but to just minimize it as much as possible, like, excuse me, and then like moving away, because it's the people who are like horrified and disgusted. Oftentimes they'll go home and masturbate to that thought later. And so the more that you can like just kind of diffuse it and not give them that energy.
Call attention to it, wouldn't help there.
Not necessarily, and one thing that sometimes is done with these, so like with frauderistic disorder, we're gonna talk about the treatments here. There's something called shame aversion. And so sometimes shaming people who do these kind of behaviors is one way to diffuse it. Like, oh, how sad, right? And then like not react, right? Like, oh, right, like so sad, right? Like whatever you can do to diffuse it. And honestly, that is something that is done with some of these, to try and link it to feelings of shame to get them to stop, right? Rather than your disgusted, horrified reaction.
Like conditioning. Shape
Right.
versus,
Mhm. Right, and that's only obviously for the ones that are like illegal. But like that might be the best way to be like, oh, how sad for you, and like move away, right? Like, I mean, that would be really challenging to do, but it would diffuse it much faster than like causing a big scene. And obviously, if you have, as I mentioned last time, if you have a paraphilia that's consensual and your partner's into it and you're into it, there's no treatment needed, right? No treatment is needed, everything is fine. But there are times where people do require treatment for these, like if it's illegal, if it's interfering with a relationship. What if you really love your partner and you can't become aroused without some kind of violence? And that's just not something that they can do, right? Like that they can get into. Like, so maybe going to couples counseling together or looking at other ways to fulfill that need outside of like your relationship or like coming to some kind of agreement with your partner. Right. So therapy can sometimes be really helpful for negotiating those differences. And there are people who specialize in treating paraphilias and fetishes, right? It wouldn't be maybe a typical counselor that you would go to, it'd be more of like a specialty area. As I was mentioning, shame aversion. So like people who are flashers or like are doing some of these these very coercive ones, making them feel ashamed and awful about it is sometimes one of the ways that we try and target it. Or trying to recondition orgasms, right? So let's say that you can only orgasm to a certain thing. Let's try and like change that a little bit through classical or operant conditioning, right? And so these are things that we can work on. There's also something called satiation therapy, which doesn't tend to be super successful. It's almost like a flooding. So with this one, what you do is you do a lot of like masturbating to something else, right? You switch at the moment of like orgasm to a more appropriate stimulus, but it requires a lot of like setup ahead of time. And so a lot of these ones down here are kind of aiming at reconditioning you to respond to something more appropriate. But again, if you and your partner are both fine with whatever your interests are, then there's no treatment that you need. It's just a preference. But when it starts to violate someone else's rights or interfere, that's when you might need, some kind of treatment for that disorder. The last thing in this chapter has to do with sex addiction, right? And this is another like really interesting, controversial topic, right? Because how do we decide how much is too much, right? Because it's going to be different for every single one of you. I guarantee if I took a poll, this would be so interesting to do. So I should do it at some point. But if I took a poll, like some of you might think once a day is too much. Others of you, like not at all, like multiple times a day is fine with me. Once a day is fine with me, whatever it might be different for each one of you, right? And so what we sometimes talk about with this is kind of how do we decide what is normal? And typically when it hits a point where like you can't function in your life or you're so driven by sex that you can't fulfill your duties and obligations, that's when it kind of crosses from normal to abnormal. Like in the beginning of a relationship and when you're young, people oftentimes will have sex every day or multiple times a day or multiple times a week, depending on like their preferences. And it tends to slow down as people have been in a relationship longer, right? It kind of progressively scales back depending on the person and the couple. But someone who has sex addiction, like it's like they can never be satisfied. They're constantly thinking about sex. They might crave it even after they've just had it. And it starts to interfere with your life. We sometimes call this nymphomania or Don Juanism, is the name for men and nymphomania for women. And as I mentioned, this is super controversial because it's so different from person to person. And the only way that we can kind of qualify it is to say that it has started to interfere with your life or cause you to have problems fulfilling your responsibilities. Or maybe it costs you relationships because you can't keep your sex drive under control. And I found a clip for this and I was very excited about it. It's from an older movie, but that's what kept popping up on the other screen here. But if you've seen the movie Blades of Glory, it's like an older comedy. I don't know why it has that music. That's just odd. The computer's been like freezing all day. Let's see if it. Okay, hold on. Yeah, it's Will Ferrell. Let's see if it's gonna work. I don't feel like I've had good technology luck today. Hold on. It's like a frozen in the most awkward. Come on. Oh, it's such a good example. You better work. I'm gonna be mad if it doesn't. Maybe I just got tired of it. Hold on. I'm not ready to give up on it yet, so let's see if I can get it to work. Actually, when it comes to like group therapy for anything, people tend to, when you get a group of people together that are all struggling with the same thing, it can get out of control very quickly, right? Like, so if you have a group of people who are all angry and they're dealing with anger and they're there for anger management, it can get very heated and out of control in that way. Bunch of people who are dealing with sex addiction, you see them all having sex in the parking lot afterward, right? And so that can be something where you have to have a lot of boundaries. But I did like how they have like the little prayer and they have a meeting and you're admitting it. This is something that a lot of people do struggle with, and it can cause problems in relationships and it can cause problems in your life as well. So it is definitely something that tends to fall within this chapter. Any other like questions, comments, thoughts, anything related to anything in this chapter before we go to the next chapter, which is chapter 17? Anything else? All right. Close this. So, bless you. So the next chapter, chapter 17, is all about power and sexual coercion. So again, not always the easiest topic. Okay, so a little bit of like a trigger warning in that way, but we'll talk about it in a very like academic way. But looking at things like sexual assault or rape, pedophilia, again, coming up, the sexual abuse of children, sexual harassment, and then intimate partner violence. So these are all kind of the things that tend to fall within this category. So we're looking at the topic of sexual violence or sexual coercion, right? And so somebody has been sexually victimized when they are deprived of their free choice, right? So they're coerced or forced to do something under like duress, either a threat, or maybe it's been held against them in some way, or some kind of violence, right? And sadly, this is something that a lot of people probably know somebody who's had this happen to them, or unfortunately maybe happened to themselves. Sexual violence is when somebody violates your consent, right? And so oftentimes forcing under like duress or threat or whatnot. And there are obviously several different types of this, as I mentioned, right? So we'll talk a little bit about each one of these different types. And so one of the most common is rape, right? And unfortunately, like this is relatively common. The statistics on this are somewhat frightening. I have 3 daughters, right? And like looking at the statistics of this, it's like 1 in like 4 or 1 in 5 people at some point in their life will be a victim of some degree of sexual violence. Now that could be anything from something mild to more severe. But when we're talking about rape or sexual assault, somebody has been deprived of their consent, something that we've been talking about, right, for a little while in the last chapter. They are not able to agree, or maybe their age or their state of mind, something about their state is preventing them from consenting to that act. And there are kind of 4 different types of sexual assault or rape that the book talks about: stranger, acquaintance, date, and statutory. And the most common is acquaintance, right? It's a little shocking to think, but the most common type of sexual violence or assault is by somebody you know, right? Maybe not well, right? They're an acquaintance, so it's not someone close to you, but it's someone that is known to the victim. Maybe it's a partner or a friend or even like a relative. Date would obviously be something that someone you are romantically involved with. The stranger, someone that is unknown to you. And statutory is when someone is under the age of consent. And that one gets really tricky, as I mentioned, when you have someone who's like 18 and 17 or 17 and 16. When you have 2 people who are under the age of 18, technically it could be categorized as a statutory like situation, but it's very rarely like persecuted. So the idea with this again is this idea of consent. And I have a video to play for you. It's that same girl, that Lacey Green, who did the other one. And I do think it's a little cringy at times, but I really like the way that she kind of shows some verbal and nonverbal signs of consent. And she talks about barriers to consent. So as much as it is a little like awkward at times, there's nothing like triggering, it's just awkward. But I will play it for you because I think it's a really good way of covering the topic of consent.